Oh, hello, this is Tak Chung from Walk with Tak. Welcome to my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video and would like to receive notification of my future video postings, please subscribe. Over the years, one of the greatest cooking challenges that I face is in cooking tofu. Tofu is actually pretty difficult to cook. However, tofu has great nutritional value. If you cook it right, it could be truly delicious. But I just have not been able to find the right formula for quite a long time. I have a cousin, I will call her Marge for the purpose of this video. She is an excellent cook and she's particularly great in cooking tofu. A number of years ago, I went to visit them and I stayed with them for the weekend. And she cooked tofu for me, and it has to be the best tofu that I have ever had. Before I had her tofu, I hardly cooked tofu at all because every time when I cook, it all seems to be a great disappointment. But after that time staying with her, eating her tofu, and she showed me how to do it, I have been eating tofu at least once or sometimes twice a week. Her tofu is truly amazing. It makes a convert into some of the people who never had tofu before. When they taste this particular version of tofu, they fall in love with it immediately. I remember one time my neighbor's daughter came over for dinner and she never had tofu in her life. And I cooked a tofu dish for her because she actually requested for it. She was curious and she just loved it at first taste. So you might ask, what is the secret of this tofu? In fact, this tofu is very similar to the famous tofu dish that you'll find in most Chinese restaurants. They call it mapo tofu. This tofu shares many of the same characteristics. So what I'm going to show you in this video is the template how to make this tofu. This template will allow you to tailor the tofu to the way how you like it. For example, mapo tofu is usually a spicy dish, but with this template, you can flavor it in whatever way that you like. In this particular version of this dish, I'm going to use a lot of tomatoes because it is the summer tomato season. The basic concept of this template is the same, and you can apply this concept to many different variations. Tofu is readily available in most supermarkets. However, the best source of tofu that I find is actually in Walmart. In the produce section of Walmart, they will always have at least 2 or 3 kinds of tofu, and most of them come in firm. This firm tofu generally come in 2 different brands, and the brand that I'm going to use today is called Azimaya. They varied from store to store. Sometimes they have a slightly different brand, but they all cost about the same. They come in a 1 pound package, and usually they cost around $1.50 a pack. For this demonstration, I'm going to cut the tofu up into a square size. The size of the tofu turned out to be quite important for the culinary experience. I'm going to cut them up into about 1 inch square. I'm going to show you a really neat method that Marge taught me in how to cut up and store the tofu after you cut them up. After cut up the cover of the tofu, Marge has a small cutting board, and she inverted the tofu onto this small cutting board. And then she sliced the tofu horizontally in half. She then first cut the tofu into strips, and then she cut them into cubes. This really is a neat technique. Then what she does is that she put the box back over the tofu, and then she invert the cutting board, and now the tofu is cut but it's back into the box. Every time I use this little technique, I think of Marge. I'm going to use my Cucina 14-inch stainless steel wok to cook this dish. I'm going to first season the wok with my spot seasoning method. If you are not familiar with this method, you can take a look at this video. After I heat up the wok for about 30 seconds, I add 2 tablespoons of canola oil, just enough to cover the bottom of the wok. I then heat up the oil and let it to smoke for about 15 seconds. This is the time when the wok are being seasoned. I first add about 1.5 cups of sliced onion into the wok. You notice that there are 2 kinds of onion, and this is not intentional. It happened that I have some left over in my prep. It really doesn't matter what kind of onion that you use. I normally prefer the red onion. I stir fry the onion for about 30 seconds until they become slightly soft. I then add the tofu into the wok. Now here it comes really what I would call the secret in cooking this dish. Marge told me that the most important thing you want the tofu to taste good is that not to break them up. So when you have the tofu in the wok, you need to stir them very carefully. As you can see, I try to turn my tofu as carefully and gently as I possibly could, and without breaking them apart. In many ways, the tofu is already cooked. So what you're doing is just try to warm them up. After seeing what Marge has done with her tofu, I realized that tofu has very different flavor and texture between when they are in their whole piece or when they break up into small chunks. For most people, including myself, I prefer tofu much better when they are in the large chunk. Next, I add the tomato into the dish. As you notice that I actually add quite a bit of tomatoes because this was a very good summer tomato production. I discovered tomato actually go very well with tofu, particularly when you season the tofu with oyster sauce, which I will show you later. In order to prevent breaking up the tofu, I stir the content very carefully. Try not to break the tofu up any further than what it is already is. Again, during this phase of cooking, a stir fry is not the main purpose. The goal is just simply cook everything down. Next, I add mushroom chunks. The mushroom are cut in such a way to blend better into the dish. In fact, you notice that they are probably about the same size as the tofu. And by cutting them into chunks, they will retain their texture. Oyster sauce goes really well with tofu, so I'm going to season the dish with oyster sauce first and then with my basic seasoning mix. The goal is to enhance the natural flavor of the ingredients. If you want to know more about my basic seasoning mix, you can take a look at this video. So the next step is I'm going to add a little bit more water to the dish. Now this is very important because ultimately I want this dish to have a rich sauce. As you can see, by this time the tomato has cut down significantly. But then I noticed that the tomatoes are still in fairly large chunk. And at that time, I remember my son loved the flavor of the tomato, but he doesn't like the texture of the tomato. So I decided I better cut it down to smaller size so it basically can disappear into the sauce. So I found myself a pair of scissors and get to work with it. I did a taste test to make sure that everything is what I expected. For a tofu dish, the flavor tend to be more intense because the tofu is relatively bland. So I'm going to add a little bit more dark soy sauce to increase the saltiness of the dish. I did another taste test and everything seems to be what I would like it to be. The next step is to thicken the sauce. That is very important for tofu because you want the sauce to be thickened up so when you eat the tofu, it clings to the tofu. This sauce is critical for the culinary experience of the tofu. A lot of time when tofu don't have this sauce, they just don't taste as good. I add the cornstarch directly to the tofu, and as you can see that I quickly use the wok spatula to mix everything up. There's other ways you can also add the cornstarch by first of all make them into a cornstarch suspension in water. I find this is not only more convenience, but at the same time, I do not add more fluid to the dish. After a few quick mix, I look at the consistency of the sauce. I decided I would like to have it a little bit thicker, so I add a little bit more cornstarch. With a few final stir to mix everything up, make sure that the cornstarch are properly dissolved into the sauce. The dish is ready. I then transfer the dish to a serving plate, and the total cook time of the dish is a little bit over 10 minutes. I actually cooked this dish for dinner the other night, just like I do all the other cooking demonstrations. I do not stage my cooking. And therefore, sometimes you can see that I have a little bit hesitation in what I'm doing because I'm just trying to think through the process as I cook. I want to again emphasize this is a template. This is a version that I cook on this particular night. Some other night, I probably will cook a slightly different version. Thank you for watching. I hope you find this video informative to you. If you do, please click the like icon below because this will help me to enhance my audience base. If you'd like to receive notifications of my future video postings, please subscribe. See you next time.